Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to SERLAC's Baptista Lecture Series. My name is Tamika Samuels-Jones, and I'm the current Associate Director of SERLAC, the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean. The title for this evening's panel is Archival Justice and Digital Collaborative Scholarship. The title for this panel was born out of the Center's continued efforts to showcase and maintain SERLAC's valuable resource center. Founded in 1978, SERLAC and its resource center were inspired by the exiled students and scholars who arrived in Canada from the military dictatorships and political upheaval of the time in Latin America and the Caribbean. It incorporates the Library of the Latin American Working Group, Environmental Justice in the Caribbean, Corporate Social Responsibility in the region, and so much more. Before we dive in, I'd like to make a short announcement. Tomorrow at 7:30 p.m., SERLAC will be hosting the Truth Be Told Michael Manley in Conversation e-book launch and discussion. This promises to be a very open and candid dialogue regarding Michael Manley's political legacy. The conversation will be guided by 4 leading scholars from the Caribbean, Canada, and the US. I will be posting the Facebook link in the chat. At this time, I'd like to hand over to Miguel Gonzalez. He is a professor in the Department of Social Science in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. He is chair of SERLAC's Baptista Lecture Series Committee, and he'll be our moderator this evening. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone again to this first panel of the year of the Baptista Lecture Series and on archival research and digital collaborative scholarship. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I'm going to pass it back to Tamika for the land acknowledgement.
Sure. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. Further, York respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. York has and will continue to honor the commitments to self-determination and sovereignty we have made to Indigenous nations and peoples. York acknowledges the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and fervently believes that academic research must continue to be the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamika. And again, welcome back to this session. I would like to remind the audience to post questions in the Q&A section on the webinar. If you get disconnected, log in back into the same link that you received when you register for this event. The event is scheduled until 4 p.m. And the panel is being recorded, and it will be made available later on our webpage at SERLAC. Also, I'm going to ask you to keep in mind that we will save some time for questions at the end. So we will first have the panelists speaking to the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, and that is Melanie White. Melanie is an assistant professor of Afro-Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Georgetown University. Her research work, her current research and book manuscript in progress examines the history of sexual and gender-based colonial violence against Black and Afro-Indigenous women and girls from what is today the Nicaraguan and Honduran Mosquitia, linking this genealogy of racialized gender and territorial dispossession with the centuries-long struggle for autonomy on the Mosquito Coast. She juxtaposes the history of intimate colonial violence in the region with the counter-colonial intimacies of Afro-Mosquitian women past and present. Specifically, Melanie explores the historical record and contemporary artistic production to highlight Afro-Mosquitian women's embodied and creative practices of colonial refusal and intimate autonomy. Melanie is also the research and content manager at the Recuerdos of the Nicaragua Archive, a digital humanities project dedicated to preserving the history and culture of the Afro-descendant and indigenous communities of the Nicaraguan and Honduras Mosquitia. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Miguel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking the SERLAC team, especially Miguel, Tamika, and Camila for the invitation and for their work organizing this critically important conversation, as well as thanking Debbie for graciously serving as our discussant. And I want to acknowledge that the land from which I am speaking to you all today and on which Georgetown University sits is the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan and Piscataway peoples. I acknowledge and respect their sovereignty over and past and present relationships with this land. I also want to acknowledge Georgetown's deep ties to the institution of slavery, which historically financed its operations. Today, I'll be presenting the first part of a joint presentation with my co-panelist Andy Zalkin on the Recuerdos de Nicaragua archive. Recuerdos de Nicaragua was founded in 2018 by curator, fashion historian, and archivist Jasmine Chavez Helm, who unfortunately could not be present on this date. Andy and I will be speaking in our capacity as members of the Archives Advisory Committee. Recuerdos de Nicaragua, which I'll hereafter refer to as Recuerdos, is a physical and digital archive that documents the histories and cultures of Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous communities on the Mosquito Coast. The Mosquito Coast is a region located in what is today the eastern portion of Honduras and eastern or Caribbean Nicaragua. I'll be focusing on the archive's critical significance in historical context, the impetus behind its creation, and on its key interventions with regard to archival justice. Then I'll pass the mic to Andy, who will share more about Recuerdos' mission and our physical and digital archival process. To begin, I'd first like to provide some reflections on the contested status of the archive in relation to the Mosquito Coast. Historians, both those academically trained and community-based, and especially those employing a critical approach, have long recognized and grappled with the colonial violence of traditional archives. Black and Indigenous historiographers in particular have had to contend not only with the fact that the quote-unquote official historical record has more often than not been constructed and dominated by the perspectives, exploits, and experiences of settlers, colonists, and enslavers, but also with Western and positivist valuations of what constitutes an archive and with what's even considered worthy of being remembered and preserved. In the case of the Mosquito Coast, the region has for many centuries and by many colonial regimes and actors been represented as a wild and uncharted terrain, rich in natural resources, and which would be ripe for the taking were it not for the region's quote unquote uncivilized Black and Indigenous inhabitants who have consistently resisted the full-scale colonial occupation of their territory. This was certainly the case with the British, who colonized and transformed the region into a relatively smaller scale plantation society in the early 17th century up until the mid-19th century, with German and later US Moravian missionaries who arrived in the region in 1849, with the US and Canada who occupied and set up resource extracting industries along the Mosquito Coast in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and finally with the Nicaraguan state, which militarily occupied and annexed the Mosquito Coast in 1894. When they appear at all in the colonial Mosquitian archive, one encounters Black and Indigenous Mosquitians not as people with full agency and autonomy, but as otherized and objectified groups and individuals navigating the constraints and everyday forms of violence that accompany life as a colonial subject. In terms of form in the Mosquitian Colonial Archive, most commonly encountered are visual and textual colonial documents such as enslavers' wills, foreign correspondence, and missionary photography, postcards, and writings. The writings, perspectives, and cultural productions of Black and Indigenous Mosquitians are much rarer, and when they do appear in the colonial archive, they often appear as decontextualized objects recast through a colonial gaze. As a diasporic community-based archive, Recuerdos locates these often difficult to find colonial documents, records, accounts, and images, and compiles them into a physical and digital repository or database of resources about the Mosquito Coast. These are then shared with our online followers, many of whom are part of the diasporic Mosquitian community. And instead of merely collecting and sharing them, however, we make sure to contextualize each item and account for the colonial and structural conditions under which each piece was created. One of the key ways we do this is through the captioning of and critical commentary about each archival piece, since many of them weren't just produced under colonial conditions, but are also in many instances completely untitled and unremarked upon. Because resources and records on and about the Mosquito Coast are widely dispersed and difficult to find, Recuerdos is also continuously crafting and piecing together a Mosquitian archive with a focus on accessibility to the Mosquitian diaspora and broader Nicaraguan, Central American, Latin American, and indeed global communities. For so long, the history of the Mosquito Coast has been obscured in the history of the Caribbean and of Central and Latin America. And this is true despite the centrality of the region to Western modernity and to major colonial enterprises in the Americas. It is precisely because of the Mosquito Coast's relative obscurity and erasure in comparison to other regions that the Recuerdos de Nicaragua archive was born. Recuerdos' origin story stems from a very personal and diasporic place. Rooted in a process of deep research into the history of the Mosquito Coast that Jasmine began in 2016 and 2017, Recuerdos was initially an outlet for Jasmine to connect with her Afro-Nicaraguan roots and history, and to share this research with the Mosquitian diaspora, both within and outside of Nicaragua. While Jasmine's father is an Afro-Nicaraguan man with alleged Mayangna Mosquitian ancestry, she was estranged from the paternal side of her family for nearly 2 decades and had few arenas through which she could learn more about Nicaraguan history and culture. Unable to travel to the region or find much in the way of a centralized archive about the Mosquito Coast, Jasmine turned to the internet and to extensive online research to satisfy her curiosity and answer lifelong personal questions. Recuerdos was, in Jasmine's words, a quote, way for her to access her history and have a venue and an angle to look at Nicaraguan culture, end quote. As a fashion historian, one of Jasmine's key research angles and interests was Indigenous Mosquitian fashion and textiles, particularly how their dress customs were transformed during the colonial period. By necessity becoming somewhat of a digital sleuth, Jasmine began to explore all corners of the internet, including sites like eBay and CardCow, in search of any and all things Mosquitia related. She found many colonial photographs, postcards, and travel literature, and even Indigenous textiles and forms of material culture. All of these items were key in Jasmine's fashion-based research, but also had so much to reveal about history, colonialism, and Black and Indigenous cultures in the region. Jasmine's thorough digital research proved to be its own kind of course on Mosquitian history, and the fact that the digital sphere was one of the key ways she was able to access this history compelled her to create a digital platform to share all she had found with others, and especially with Mestiçans and Mestiçan descendants. Thus, in 2018, the culmination of Jasmin's research resulted in the creation of a Recuerdos de Nicaragua Instagram page and TikTok account through which we disseminate our collection. In 2021, and as a result of Recuerdos' growing collection, Jasmin made the decision to reach out to Recuerdos followers on social media regarding the formation of an advisory committee. The idea, especially because Jasmin is clear about never having been to the region, was to share the archive with Indigenous and Afro-Descendant Mestiçans and to compose a team of people either from or in critical solidarity with it and the necessity for a Mestiçan archive. As a member of the Afro-Mestiçan diaspora, I joined the advisory committee as a research and content manager, and in this capacity, I conduct research to obtain new acquisitions and devise critical captions for our materials. I'll also be hosting lectures and workshops on the history of the region and contributing to the publications and exhibitions we plan to write and curate in the near future. Besides Jasmin and Andy, our other advisory committee member is K. Marshall McKenzie, Recuerdos' community and outreach associate, and his work has been critical to the relationships we've built with Mestiçan communities, especially musicians and cultural producers. In addition to being run by and for members of the Mestiçan diaspora and those in solidarity with it, Recuerdos shines a spotlight on a severely neglected region within Latin America and the Caribbean, approaches the histories, presence, and tangible and intangible cultures of the Mosquito Coast with a critical anti-colonial perspective, includes both historical and contemporary oral histories, cultural memory, ephemeral records, and art and cultural production as crucial elements of the always ongoing Mestiçan archive, provides access to our archival collection to the Mestiçan diaspora and broader publics through the digital sphere, encourages engagement, commentary, critique, and feedback on our work and materials, and strives to be a resource and platform available to existing archival and cultural initiatives, especially those based in Caribbean Nicaragua, to amplify their work and reach a broader audience. Recuerdos' ultimate goal is not, were it even possible, to be an authority on the Mosquito Coast, but instead to facilitate and provide access to critical engagement with the region's past and present. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Andy now.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And I'm going to introduce briefly Andy Salkin, our next panelist, which is also part of the Recuerdos de Nicaragua collective. Andy is a photographer, photojournalist, and a digital archivist based in New York. Andy graduated from the Fashion Institute of Technology with a BFA in photography and related media and a minor in art history. She's currently a research assistant at the picture collection of the New York Public Library at Bryant Park and a digital archivist for Recuerdos de Nicaragua. Andy Salkin also recent work has been published in the New York Times and the New York Magazine. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miguel, and thank you, Melanie, for your work. Thank you, everyone at York, for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? Volume? Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hang tight for a moment. View. Okay, great. Let's see here. Share screen. Okay. Great. So let's start from the beginning. Yes, so thank you for having me. Today I will speak about our process of building a digital library, some of the boundaries and limitations we face as a small archive, and what we see for the future of our digital collection. For our team at Recuerdos de Nicaragua, our efforts are inherently about justice. Through our research, we have found that institutional archival emphasis has largely been placed on Nicaragua and Honduras's central and western populations. Even these collections can miss critical opportunities to celebrate the rich cultural history, either through lack of emphasis on archival presentation or due to solely prioritizing political history, which for us does not encompass all of the beauty and creativity that thrives in the region. In her initial efforts in Hasmin's initial efforts and through our research as a team, we quickly discovered the limited consolidated collections of Msgr objects that are free, available, and easy to navigate. Just as we are not concerned with being a source of authority, our emphasis as an archive is also not placed in permanent or private collection ownership of historical objects. What we are truly passionate about is to provide a service and platform for people to understand and explore resources from the Indigenous Coast history, presenting these resources through thoughtful curation and preserving any acquired objects as best as we can with the limited resources that we have. Technology and social media have played a critical role in not only uniting our team, who are from different diasporas, cultures, and regions, but also in the remote contributions to historical preservation that we're able to facilitate. For our founder, Hasmin, the inception of the archive was driven by a level of personal inquiry, which has subsequently expanded to provide a connective platform for other people. It's important in this moment for me to pause and speak to the transnational nature and approach of our work. I am a white passing Latina. I was born and raised in Western culture, and I'm a non-diasporic archivist. So justice to me means making the distinction between collaboration and contribution. Collaborative efforts are completely at the discretion of the Black and Indigenous communities of the Mosquito Coast. As the digital archivist, it is my responsibility to follow the lead of community members, academics, and adjacent groups in terms of not only what objects they are willing to share with us for the archive, but how these resources are honored and presented. I like to say that I contribute to archival justice in the sense that I am not looking to become a sole authority or present any air of exclusivity in terms of the work that I do for Recuerdos. The public nature of our archive and the efforts we make towards building the collection are just one way that we can use our privileges as researchers and archivists with access to education and digital resources to honor these communities that are historically underrepresented. Now we can take a closer look at our archival process. To acquire new objects, we typically use platforms like eBay as online resources, searching through private collections of assorted textiles, objects, and pictures that are available online. We usually start by using keywords like Bluefields, Mosquito or Mosquito Coast. Sometimes we will search by using specific towns or regions, which will yield different results. If the object is something that we can afford at that time, then we will purchase it. Authenticity is truly a guessing game. Over time, we have begun to recognize some distinct publishers and photographer names, specifically when looking for postcards, books, and rare printed images for our collection. Photographer George Schmidt and also the Moravian Church have surfaced as repeat image publishers. We can also authenticate cultural objects for sale through copyright information that is sometimes provided in the sale listing. Anything that is a textile or handmade object requires some digging, and like many remote acquisitions, requires faith of authenticity. Once these objects are in our possession, Melanie and Hasmin write detailed descriptions of the object with relevant information. I'm in charge of cleaning the artifact and using still life photographic techniques to build a library of high resolution images of all sides of the object. We don't typically scan artifacts anymore. We find that photographing them is our way of maintaining a physical object quality instead of a flat lay image, and helps place emphasis on the 3D nature of what we've acquired. As a digital archivist on a diverse remote team, I have learned that a unified effort will yield beautiful results. Through this work that we do at Recuerdos, technology can be used as an accessible tool to combat historical archival boundaries, educate us all on Indigenous and Afro-Descendant cultures and practices, and explore well-curated visual resources. Our archive is still very, very young. We are still in the process of building the skeleton of our website and permanent digital collection. But already I have learned that it is the responsibility of those with access to technology and education to not only reach across diasporas, but to grant affected communities the authoritative say in whether they would like to be represented, what these archives visually represent, and what these presentations communicate about their history and cultures. One of the most common barriers for any small archive is access to finances. Our acquisitions, archival practice, and preservation efforts are entirely funded by Hazmin, which is costly and difficult for an individual person. I offer the archival services that I can, and in the early stages, I relied heavily on borrowed studio and equipment access from my peers who were in solidarity with my work. Language barriers can also slow down our ability to collaborate at the rate and frequency we would like to, especially when it comes to direct contact with members of the diaspora. Some of us speak English, others Spanish, and learning the Mosquito language is a goal we have collectively as an archive. Again, this requires time, money, and training that is difficult as an independently operated archive. We are also extremely mindful and respectful of the cultural differences between ourselves and the Indigenous and Afro-Descendant communities we interact with. We must always approach community members with the goal of providing a platform for their history and without a personal agenda or air of authority. As an archive, we would love to visit the Mosquito Coast and work directly with archives, universities, and community members to expand our archive and record oral histories. This is a dream of ours which combines all of the aforementioned difficulties, but we are optimistic about making this dream a reality for the benefit not only of our archive, but to help provide robust access for others to cultural and historic information about the region. I was not trained in archival or library practices, so speaking from the role of digital archivist, I had to self-teach and draw from my personal experience with commercial still life lighting techniques, metadata organization, and my art history education to figure out how to build a visual collection. We also invested many hours recently in researching archival websites and museum websites to draw inspiration for the new consolidated online archive website we are currently building. We are a very new archive, so I would like to address this topic as a hopeful list of future alliances where we can contribute to digital historic preservation and education. We are very curious to be in touch with people who are directly affected by our archive, either because of personal connection to the region or personal and academic research. It's important that we begin our efforts with publishers and universities, both within the Mosquito region and outside. There are places that might have access to materials and knowledge to share with us. From an archivist perspective, I personally wish to continue to learn about archival practice, either through self-directed research or through a formal archival education. We appreciate and heavily rely on the support from within the Mosquito community and other Central American communities at large who share our images online and share our posts. This helps us spread our archives so that more people have access and become aware of what we're trying to build. Other potential resources for contributions and collaborations include the Bluefields Archive at the Center for the Investigation and Documentation of the Atlantic Coast, or CIDCA, the Bluefields Indian and Caribbean University, University of the Autonomous Region of the Caribbean Coast of Nicaragua, WANI, the Journal of Caribbean Nicaragua, and the Alumni Association of the Colegio Moravo, which is a digital initiative on Facebook. We also welcome any individual scholars in the US who have direct ties to the coastline and could potentially have knowledge to share with us about what we do. And with that, I will yield my time. Thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Andy and Melanie, for this amazing presentation and for sharing certainly the Recuerdos de Nicaragua Digital Archive. And I also would like to acknowledge your contribution to the conceptualization of this panel. So thank you very much for that. And also to Jasmine, with whom we had earlier communication as well. So thank you. Our next presenter is Embert Charles. Embert is a media specialist and Caribbean heritage activist from St. Lucia, West Indies. For 10 years, Embert was executive director of the Folk Research Center, FRC, in St. Lucia, established in 1973 as a repository of St. Lucia's cultural heritage. Embert has also held top administrative, managerial, and leadership positions in the public sector, including managing director of the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Regulatory Authority from 2008 to 2017. Since 2019, Embert has served as the president of the World Association for Christian Communication, or WAC for the acronym, as an international NGO that promotes communication rights and social justice around the world. Embert has a master's degree in telecommunications regulation and policy from the University of West Indies, Jamaica, and also a master in philosophy in development studies from the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. Embert is a member of the International Institute of Communications, the St. Lucia National Trust, and the Telecommunications Executive Management Institute of Canada. Welcome, Embert, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Miguel, and thanks to your team for inviting us to share our experiences with you, and for the other panelists also, thanks very much. I was very enthralled by the presentation from I think it's Melanie and her colleague. Certainly it echoes a lot of the genesis of our work at the Folk Research Center, but certainly focusing on not simply on the visual, but also on the audio. And my presentation will speak to, I will share my screen now. My presentation will speak to, I should go to the start. Yeah. So here am I think you could read it. Caribbean French Creoles, Historical and Contemporary Prejudices. And what we have been doing, programming for redress, respect, and representation. Whereas Caribbean French Creoles manifest themselves in quite a number of countries in the region, not only those that are colonized by the French, but those colonized by the British as well. The question of the prominence of the language is higher in places like St. Lucia and Dominica as official English-speaking independent states. We know, of course, of the situation in Haiti, where Creole is not only popular, but Creole is official. So I will sort of make a reference to them, but essentially looking at the work that we have done at the Folk Research Center in trying to address the issues of prejudices and so forth. So the question of documentation, I will just put it in context that in our Caribbean colonial and post-colonial societies, social status and recognition were defined to a large extent by legislation. You are owned by someone or by some company, so that determines what was your place in society. Status was also defined by your ethnicity. You know the role that and the positioning of the enslaved Africans in this part of the world. And it was not only social status, but also the economic and political status or lack thereof. By function, providing labor for these societies, and that essentially boxed them into certain geographical areas, into certain spaces in these societies where they were restricted from their movements. And naturally, whatever developed and whatever innovations took place had to take place within these confined spaces, except in cases where you had the rebellions and the Maroon Age, which manifests itself a lot in cases like St. Lucia, most of the countries, but primarily in countries like Jamaica and Suriname, where Maroon Age was prominent very recently in this Suriname context. And of course, by culture and gender. Creole languages were critical markers of identity in these societies. Now, we ought not to confuse the term Creole, because Creole is a very broad term used to define a group of people. You were Creoles, whether it was defined by your skin tone or your color. It was defined by your origins, or in a sense, where you existed in certain societies, in certain parts of the world, you were called Creoles. But the Creole I'm referring to is essentially the Creoles that are a body of Antillean languages. And most of them were French-based. There were also English-based Creoles, which is another body of work that we can also speak to at some point in time. But Creoles were conduits also to repositories of information and traditions. Getting into the mind of many of these of people could only be done through their language. Getting into their soul, as we said, could be done through their language. So hence the reason why it was so significant for us at the Folk Research Center when we started our work in trying to map the cultural landscape of the country. The French Creoles existed alongside the main European languages, the English, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch, to some extent the Portuguese. And the Creole became key tools for subversion, for mobilization, and for liberation. Up to now, we are aware that our own people in the diaspora tend to utilize Creole when they essentially want to move away from the dominance of the language in these developed countries where they exist, and to share stories and communicate in a manner that the former colonial masters will not understand. The Creole, and I use the term Creole, Creole, and Creoles, because Creole actually is the description and the name given to the St. Lucian version of the Creole. The W, its prominence, just as a side, is prominent because of the emphasis of pronunciation. The R's were not a very strong pronunciation in St. Lucia, and this is some work that there are several theories as to why, compared to places like Martinique and Haiti, where the R is more prominent in pronunciation. Has become a subject of research and study by linguists, historians, and communicators in the Caribbean, all the universities such as University des Antilles, University of the West Indies, and of course, people in the diaspora of Caribbean descent who are linguists, historians, and educators. St. Lucian Creole is a variety, as I mentioned earlier, of Caribbean French lexicon Creole. So the lexical base of the language is actually French, but in St. Lucia spoken by the majority of the St. Lucian population. I just want to quote one of the foremost academics on the St. Lucian Creole, Professor Lawrence Carrington, former principal of the University of Guyana and senior lecturer in linguistics and education at the University of the West Indies, where he describes the grammar as a retention of grammatical patterns and processes of African languages spoken by Africans in the plantation setting, the reinterpretation of French grammar by the Africans, and universal forces of language creation, forces of change. This is cited in Carrington 1992, which is really Carrington's preface to a body of work on St. Lucian lexicon, which was actually authored by Jones Mondesi, a St. Lucian educator, the first producer of a St. Lucian Creole dictionary. So in essence, what we have is a syntax, a grammar pattern, which reflects and embodies all the experiences of peoples in the New World. There are elements of the syntax and the grammar, which researchers have identified to link with some of the language of the indigenous people of the New World, the Kalinago people. Another author, Morgan Dalfinis, who took a different approach where he tried to make a direct link between the Creoles in the Caribbean and African languages, and his work on Caribbean and African languages is perhaps a piece of work that requires reading by anyone interested in Creole languages and the links between Creole societies in the Caribbean and those and Creole societies in other parts of the world. And he says that the social context for the Caribbean Creoles was the Atlantic slave trade, involving enslavement of Africans by Europeans for economic profit, as well as being a social context for exploitation. However, the Caribbean social context is one of African resistance, readaptation, and perpetuation of African culture in the teeth of an attempt to enforce European culture on captured people. And I spoke of a language of rebellion, a language of resistance, and that's what Creoles in the Caribbean stood for. And a lot of the slaves, the enslaved Africans, at times of rebellions, communicated a lot in Creole, and of course were able to evade the colonial officials as far as their ability to capture them or to find out where they were. The historiography of the French Creoles, just to put it again in a broader context, first characterized the language as a language of toothless old women. H.H. Breen, who was reputed to have produced the first official history of St. Lucia, really he described the language as gibberish because he couldn't understand it, and most of the colonials could understand it. And this set the basis for eras of prejudice on the language. Once you set off in an official document by describing language of the majority of enslaved people and also of free people at the time as a language of toothless old women, it means that you couldn't understand it. It was gibberish. It was unintelligible. You set the basis for the type of attitude and prejudices that would prolong for up to today. In many academic and official records, it is described as broken French or patois. Now we know a patois is essentially a pidgin, and broken French, because it was the lexical base was French, and some of the words were not French words but of French origin. It was described as broken French, not realizing that in the development of any language as the forces of change, as Carrington mentioned earlier on, creates the basis for a new language. So in our Caribbean societies, Creole is alongside Jamaican, Trinidadian, Bajan, Papiamento, Shran and Tongo as what we call nation languages. They define a nation of people. And that's why it was so important for us to do that extensive research work on the language. But the respect and recognition came as early as 1869 in a seminal work by J.J. Thomas, who wrote a book on the theory and practice of Creole grammar. And that gave some kind of foundation for linguists and sociolinguists of today to develop the orthography and the writing system for the St. Lucian Creole. In the early 80s, there was extensive research and documentation, which was really shared through a series of orthography conferences, some in St. Lucia, some in the United States, where a number of prominent linguists, a number of prominent cultural activists, a number of prominent educators were involved in that process. And names on that just to signal a few of them Pierre Vernet of Haiti, Lawrence Carrington of Trinidad, which is one of the places in the Caribbean, official English, where Creole is also spoken. Raphael Confiant, a professor and also an author in Martinique, Jamal Lafontaine of Dominica, and Paulette Louisy of St. Lucia, who I will speak a little later, who was the Governor General of St. Lucia and introduced Creole speaking in what we call the throne speech in Parliament for the entire tenure of her reign as Governor General. And of course, Patrick Anthony, after whom the center has been named, the Monsignor Anthony Patrick Anthony Folk Research Center, who was the founder of the center and very much involved as academic, as a theologian and cultural activist. And he brought the dimension of introducing the relevance of the Creole for the preaching of the gospel. The integration into the formal education system was somewhat facilitated in terms of the debate. It hasn't been integrated as yet by other academics like Hazel Simmons MacDonald, Martha Isaac, and Morgan Dalfinis. Hazel Simmons MacDonald was the dean of the open campus of the University of the West Indies, a St. Lucian educator who did quite a lot of research work in schools to identify the place of English as a second language for most of the early learners. Hence the reason why one had to approach teaching of English as a second language in a St. Lucian context. The approaches to address Creole language and in the use of police investigations by another academic St. Lucian called Sandra Evans, where she did quite a bit of research and discovered that testimonies given by Creole speakers or statements given by Creole speakers to police, most cases misinterpreted, because the police actually thought, well, this is not a language, I could write whatever I want. They would never have a day in court. And that has signaled quite a bit of revelation for our justice system in St. Lucia and Dominica as well. And our own historiography in terms of the language and where the language is represented, it started as early as the 1950s with anthropologists like Harold Simmons, Daniel Corley, and Alan Lomax, who at the time were capturing a lot of the history of St. Lucia through song. But in most of these songs, one had to ensure one understood the language, because most of the songs were actually in Creole. So there you had the early documentation of Creole through these audiovisual recordings. And today we take it for granted where digital recording exists, but with analog, there are particular challenges of recording as well, which we are come to realize that's over time, if we are not able to transfer some of these holdings into digital format, they'll eventually break down because of the nature of the technology. The Folk Research Center was established in 1973, and its primary aim was to map the cultural landscape of St. Lucia, cultural practices, oral literature, the traditional belief systems as well. Then we moved on to developing the orthography through a grassroots national movement to capture words, pronunciation, etc. It was important that the work on the Creole was not solely residing within the academic sphere of linguists, but linguists had to find the energy and the authenticity from somewhere else, where the people actually speak the language. And this is where the Folk Research Center pioneered since 1973, a lot of that research work, where a lot of volunteers, secondary school students, like myself at the time, went into the communities with small reel-to-reel tapes and the cassette recorders at the time. This is what we had. Some people today may not even know what a reel-to-reel tape looks like, or even a cassette recorder. But we captured as much as possible all the language, the intonations, all the nuances of the language. We moved to the formal orthography conferences I spoke about earlier, but critically, emerging out of that was a creation of a global group of Creole-speaking countries called Banzil Creole. Banzil is essentially a Creole term to say group of islands. Ban is group, Zil, island. So group of islands, so Banzil Creole. And the members were Dominica, St. Lucia, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyana, that's French Guyana, Haiti, Mauritius, Seychelles, Reunion, and Louisiana. Louisiana, where you have a lot of people from the diaspora. But in the Caribbean, you can add also to that group Trinidad and Tobago, and also Grenada, where they have Creole spoken as well. And then, of course, in Seychelles, where Creole is an official language. We had the production of a writing of a handbook on writing Creole, dictionary of St. Lucian Creole. Then we moved to popularize the work, the research work, in the observance of International Creole Day, which is a mass public event where people are invited to celebrate the language, but at the same time, in doing that, we try to capture by recording, people speak the language and instances of the language use in all of the various domains. A large body of literature has been produced. Dictionary, we did a newspaper entirely in Creole, songs and lessons in Creole, and the national anthem of St. Lucia has been translated in Creole and has been officially recognized by the government of St. Lucia for use in official events. So we now move to what perhaps is the meat of the matter. What sort of narratives that militated against the documentation and the archiving? Because essentially the archiving was not being done officially. It had to be done by grassroots organizations like the Folk Research Center. And there were mountains of obstacles before us. Primarily, the debate was about the lack of global functionality of the language. That Creole does not meet the highest levels of communication for commerce and governance in a capitalist world. Why should we be doing work on the language when in a few years it will disappear? If it is a language of toothless old women, when these old women die, there's no need for them to communicate with each other. So get to the program and speak English. That was and that narrative still persists to some extent. Then, of course, the undeveloped technical and linguistic features of the language. A lot of work has been done on the syntax, on the lexicon that is continually improving, really to defy some of these criticisms that the Creole language doesn't meet the tests of linguistic features of what is a normal language. The association of the language speakers with the era of enslavement, underdevelopment, and backwardness was again a very strong argument coming from the elites in the society that, you know, we are modernizing and then we're trying to keep people back. If you want to promote Creole, why don't you have a little anthropological enclave and let people speak their language as they want and show to tourists when they visit St. Lucia that we have, this was what happened a few years ago, but it doesn't have the functionality in the modern world. Then you had the identity crisis, where people were torn, carrying both the nationalistic sentiments of, I can speak Creole, but then I don't want to be associated with the undesirable backwardness of our society. So, you know, you would go abroad and then, you know, you would show off that when time is right to do that, you show up, but at times when criticism is mounting, you would sort of withdraw from that association with the language. These discriminations existed in almost every domain where the language is used. Households, schools, churches, businesses, and government. I just need to just stick a pin on churches. Now, ironically, a lot of priests, particularly the French priests at the time, saw the importance of using Creole. And in fact, some of them translated liturgies very early. But up to today, the church in St. Lucia has not accepted what is a formal liturgy to be used in Creole and on a regular basis. You still have a full Creole Mass. When you reach the liturgy, it is back into English or Latin, because the argument is that you don't get the full reverence of the worship if you use the Creole language, because there's lack of precision of the terminology to convey the meaning of the liturgy in Creole. So,
Embert, I'm sorry to say you have about 3 minutes left.
yes. So I will go to the counter narratives quickly, which is again, and then just wrap up. So the counter narratives is really the work. The main counter narrative at the time was really the work of the Folk Research Center, the work of a number of the academics at the universities, but also where countries officially recognize the language, that was putting pressure on those who did not recognize. And even if they did not recognize it officially, they begin to be a bit lenient in providing some support and allowing the research work to continue. We had the translation of the New Testament in Creole, which for a lot of people was important because the question of worship is so important to people that if they can get the Testament in Creole, it means the Creole has some functionality for them. And of course, other work being done for children and so forth. It is now being used widespread in the society for commercial reasons and has been integrated into the throne speech in Parliament. The throne speech, for those of you who are not coming from the sort of parliamentary democracy that's akin to the UK, is where the Governor General speaks on behalf of the Queen. In our case now, is the King. And people have argued, but Queen can't speak Creole. Why should you put Creole in the Queen's throne speech? But that is something for another time. And of course, the popular celebration of Junior Creole through creative music and creative arts. The collaboration that we have been doing over the years, initially through bands in Creole I mentioned earlier, recently through an extensive but very iterative training program with the Caribbean campus in Trinidad and Tobago led by Roll Gibbons. We have done some work with WAC through they support our work on Creole and the role of Creole as an indigenous language and as part of communication rights of people. And of course, UNESCO has funded quite a lot of our work. UNESCO just recently announced 2022 to 2020, I think from 2022 onwards as a decade of indigenous languages. And we have been working recently with United Nations Development Program, UNDP, on translating the Sustainable Development Goals into Creole so it could be used in the formal domains. And finally, last slide, Miguel, are we winning the battle of the narratives? It's ongoing. The discrimination will continue because of the absence of official support and official recognition in the St. Lucian context. There are still sort of mounting barriers of entry into the formal education system, although a lot of research work is continuing. And the content narratives is continuing to expand the body of work. More research, more advocacy, more recognition. In fact, people are beginning to vote for the acceptance of Creole, especially in the creative arts, because once you use it there, there's no question about it. There's no question whether it's official or not, but it's used and it's accepted. And in recent times, I'm sure some of you may have been exposed to a number of viral social media stories of language advocacy where people are claiming their language vis-a-vis the disrespect of persons who don't understand their language. So this is it for me, and just a few references and I will share the slide presentation as soon as I'm through. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Embert, for your presentation. I believe it does provide a very comprehensive historical overview of the Creole in St. Lucia, and I'm very sure that you will connect to other themes being addressed this afternoon as well. Our next presenter is Stanley Griffin. Stanley is a deputy
Good day, Stanley.
Sorry?
No, yep. Stanley, good day.
Okay. Stanley Griffin is a Deputy Dean, Undergraduate Matters, Humanities, and Senior Lecturer in Archival and Information Studies in the Faculty of Humanities and Education in the Department of Library and Information Studies at the University of West Indies in Mona, Jamaica campus. He holds a BA Honors in History, a PhD in Cultural Studies from the Cave Hill, Barbados campus at the University of West Indies, and also a Master in Science Just 1 second. In Archives and Records Management International, University of Dundee in Scotland. Stanley Griffin, his research interests include multiculturalism in Antigua and the Eastern Caribbean, the cultural dynamics of intra-Caribbean migrations, archives in the construct of the Caribbean culture, and community archives in the Caribbean. Stanley is active on the executive of several academic, heritage, and archival professional societies, including the Caribbean's Archival Association, Caribica, and is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Information, Diversity, and Inclusion. Stanley, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Miguel, for this privilege of sharing with you and to the other members of the SERLAC team for this opportunity. I want to focus this afternoon on the experiences of colleagues in St. Kitts and Nevis, a place that is close to my heart. My family, my paternal side is from that territory. And if I were to give you one phrase that you should walk away with, at least from my own presentation, is that the archival injustices that have affected the Caribbean can be dealt with, can be reversed by acknowledging that culture is more than just living and breathing and having or being, but it is actually a form of using what we know to inform, and in so doing to empower our communities. So I will be reflecting on the website of Historic St. Kitts, and I want to do 3 things. I really want to show, I am hoping, because as you may have heard, I am now an archival educator. I teach more than I practice. I don't have an institution, but I really want to focus this afternoon's conversation on the ways in which we can correct or balance the injustices as it relates to archives, especially from the Caribbean experience. And in so doing, consider how cultural expressions are not just expressions of our people's way of life or things they do or understandings of themselves, but are really ways of remembering, ways of documenting, ways of sharing, ways of keeping their societies together. And in so doing, I want to reflect on the work of Victoria O'Flaherty, one of our national archivists in the region, one of our stalwarts really. And what I will be describing, the Historic St. Kitts website was really her forte, her project that she really advocated a lot for. Sadly, Vicky passed during the course of this semester, and I really want to use this opportunity to honor her and her work and the ways in which, through her use of the archives, her promotion of the archives, and her understanding of culture and marrying archives and culture, she was able to create a space that gives validity to cultural practices as memory and as indeed archival. So, in illustrating the archival injustice, let's be very clear, the archives in the Caribbean were the products of the results of colonialism, right? And so all the documentation from plantation deeds, church registers, all of them were about plantation work, were about colonialism. In one of the early definitions about a colony within the British understanding of self was the word plantation, a self-financing entity with relation with the crown. And so it was this means of creating wealth. So persons were either coming to the Caribbean to work, to gain wealth, to work for someone being wealth, gaining their wealth, or to develop wealth in the region. And so what we understand now as records are really the result, the reflection of those who wrote, right? And as Vicky said in one of her early writings, since power and the ability to create archives rested with the elite, The records naturally reflected the events that they felt were important. So there's a real disconnect between the archival institution, the records in the institution, and what generally people understand and remember and validate as part of their own identities, their own consciousness, their own memory. So in the Caribbean, we are caught, I want to argue, with, you know, this politics of memory. What really are archives? Now, you'll see an image there of a register being repaired. Again, Vicky was instrumental in getting her archives. This register actually comes from the St. Kitts archives being digitized and repaired, but it focused on the perspective, the perception of those who wrote it. And so I argue we have this understanding in the region that if it is written, it is knowledge. It comes from above, it is accurate. We don't need to vouch it, we don't need to verify. While in the other side, we have cultural expressions. And according to a work done by Caroline Cooper in thinking about marginalized cultures in Jamaica, within the Jamaican context, she said there is this idea of knowledge, the written, but the expression, the living, the moving, the things that we don't fully understand from a Eurocentric perspective, we refer to that as noise. Yet, in our understanding of memory and in our understanding of our past and our present, groups, the society is split. There will be those who rely on the written, and chances are those who will rely on the written may have claims to Eurocentric relations. And I could spend some more time on that, but I won't. And then there are those from the other side of the population, who descendants of enslaved, descendants of indentured, who have a cultural connection and whose memories, whose past, whose documentation are living, breathing, experienced, but not written. And so, what are the archives? What should the archivists in the Caribbean look after? Just the written text, chances are prepared before independence? Or are we supposed to be really reflecting on all this memory, all these memory forms, all these living activities that are taking place, having it their way around us? So Caribbean society, as I mentioned, is based on colonialism. And one of our theorists, Kamau Brathwaite, had this idea of described it as creolization. Again, kind of linked it to Embert's discussion just now, where the formation of Caribbean society was through this hegemony, this yoking, where the European masters enforced their culture, their power over those who they subjugated and controlled. However, there was this resistance, right? This desire to retain their humanity, retain their cultural expressions, retain their sense of self. If you were to understand this yoking from a records perspective, the ideas you'll see is that via the written word that happened. We use diaries, plantation logs, slave registers, wills, blue books to oppress. Yet those who performed, those who resisted, used songs, dances, rhythms, stories, dress, language, rituals to maintain. And so, again, I'm honoring Vicky's work. If we recognize that the archive was an inherent part of the machinery of colonialism, we become conscious of the limitations it has in contributing to the history of those who were colonized. Even though there is a sense of self, we can identify we are here because of that process. It is a history that is part of the yoking, but however, we do have our own response. We do have our own narratives. And so in St. Kitts, I should have mentioned this earlier, the case of St. Kitts and Nevis is important because it was the first place the British colonized after, in fact, if my memory serves me right, even before Jamaica. In fact, the British and the French, so the idea was the Spanish had conquered, if you know your Caribbean map, the Spanish had landed in Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and to some extent Jamaica and Cuba. And there was this fine line between Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and the Eastern Caribbean, of which St. Kitts is a part. The St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua, those territories were inhabited by the indigenous populations. And there was this understanding, Hilary Beckles, the historian, noted that we are not going to fight with the Spanish, but we're going to make sure we try to get rid of the indigenous. And so the French and the British joined together to fight off the indigenous. And you know, a long story. But the idea is, there is this complex understanding of colonialism in St. Kitts and Nevis. A complexity coming out of that British-French presence, that British-French resistance to the indigenous resistance to that initial colonial period, but more so the experience of enslavement and the labor movements of the 1930s, 1940s post-war era, which swept from St. Kitts and Nevis around the entire Caribbean and triggered the moves towards self-governance and later independence. And so I want us to understand that there is literally two archives happening. There is one, the repository in the government office, and there's one living and breathing in the communities. All right. And so what Vicky noted, and when she presented a lecture to our students, she made it quite clear that because of her skin type, there was this view that she was trying to perpetuate the memory, the history of the colonizer, and not able to capture and speak to and hope to preserve that of those who were subjugated. And she argued the oral tradition was really where the memory was, right? The gossip of the village gives rise to a history that is immediate, accessible, and appealing to people whose roots have been severed and who were governed by this alien elite. And so there was a disconnect with the written word, a disappreciation, if not disrespect, for the repository, the official, the text of the colonizer. And so if you were to think of culture as memory, the expressions of the culture is where the archives is. Or if I should break it down even further, the expressions of the culture, each expression is a record. Each expression is a particular memory form, it's a particular form of understanding, a particular way of engaging with the narratives of the past. So while in the colonial structure, the written word structure, the writing, it was those who wrote, who had the authority. For the marginalized, it was the singers, right? The community, the singers, the musicians, the dancers, the storytellers, the community leaders, who were central to creating, disseminating, and preserving information. So even in our present-day societies, the carnival is where you would find these expressions. The work of the Calypsonian is through the songs that he or she will sing, is where you'll get to capture the details of the past year, or the understanding of recent events. So if I could, I want to make a quick comparison, if possible, between the traditional archives in St. Kitts and the festival, where all these expressions are displayed in their Christmas carnival, referred to as Sugar Mass. In St. Kitts, it's a very weak traditional archival infrastructure. It's basically a one-room operation in the government building. In fact, one of Vicky's concern was prior to her retirement in 2019, that her replacement has not been named. Her replacement has still not been named, right? There was this emphasis on, particular record forms that demoralize, subjugated, right? Slave registers are about people who are seen as slaves, right? There's this view that the written word, the archival, is white people oriented, white people focused, and it didn't help that only those who came from the UK or the US to research were of that particular look. And so, there's a disconnect that past with present, and therefore seen as irrelevant and seen as, not needed for a post-independent sense of self. However, in the Carnival, it represents the past triumphs over the colonial period, the colonial identities. The Carnival becomes this repository, a living archive for understanding Kittitian memory, understanding Kittitian details of self. It allows for the creation and space for recording these happenings. It serves as a documentation for current issues, current events, through music, storytelling, and so forth. It helps to preserve the stories of enduring value. If you're an archival student, a record is considered of archival value if it is of enduring value, continuing value. And the Carnival serves as this access point, this reading room of sorts for understanding how that society, the details of that society. What Vicky was able to do was to bring these two worlds together, these two halves of the St. Kitts society together, through various stages, of course, but finally with this website called Historic St. Kitts. Its precursor version was Historic Msgr. Through her work and through her ability to bring community memory into the archive and make it as accessible as the documentations, the records she had in her strong room, she brought both sides into this website and made it very accessible, very comprehensive. She allowed and validated community memory as having enduring value by placing details and expressions in context with and as accessible as the written text. She was able to make both strands of Kittitian archival and collective memory accessible, and finally illustrates to my mind that it is indeed possible. It takes a lot of work, I'm rushing over things, but it is possible to decolonize the archives in such a way where those that were subjugated are given voice, are given pride of place, and made accessible. And so if you were to take quickly a look at the website, just a screenshot, you would notice that there are details here that obviously, without a doubt, came from the records. And there are details there that obviously, without a doubt, coming from the community. And so you're able to capture via the website, via this placement, a real fuller, deeper, richer, I would hope, understanding of the Kittitian experience, and more so the history of a place that, quite frankly, historically is different from the usual places we talk about in Caribbean history, the Jamaica, the Barbados, the Trinidad and Tobago, right? What eventually also came out of her work, or what led to this work, was this ability to teach courses just focusing on St. Kitts and Nevis history, simply by bringing the written text and the community, the cultural, via digital form. And so I want to end here. The challenge we have is that if and when people do not see themselves in their national heritage, if people do not see themselves in their national archives, chances are they will feel excluded, chances are they will not have an affinity, and chances are they will not be interested or use it. The privilege is ours to ensure that we promote, bring together, recognize, and appreciate the cultural as archival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stanley, for that amazing presentation as well on identity, community, memory. I think your presentation certainly connects or branches out to many themes that we have discussed this afternoon. We do have a comment by one of our York community members, and that's Debbie Eban Schlums. We want to save some time for her to provide commentary to your presentations. I'm going to say a few things about Debbie. Debbie is an artist, researcher, and Vanier scholar pursuing a doctoral degree in cinema and media studies at York University. Her research explores archiving methodologies of the Jamaican diaspora through storytelling and media art installation. Debbie was co-director of the Fabulous Festival of French Film from 2016 to 2020, and also co-producer of the Saugeen Takes on Film, and she is also a member of the Odemin Runners Club Media Art Collective, forming new connections between Indigenous and Jamaican communities through the arts. And we're going to give Debbie about 10 minutes in order to provide comments. And hopefully we'll have maybe we can take a few questions from the audience as possible. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Melanie, Andy, Embert, and Stanley for sharing your research perspectives and provocations on Caribbean archives. There's so many threads in which these presentations weave into each other, and also with my own research on Jamaican diasporic archives. And I'm just going to touch on three themes that resonated with me. And one was language, the other's counter-narrative, and the other's community integration with archival practice. And all of these are supporting archival justice. And I was also thinking through these presentations through the concept of sound, and I'm drawing on Andrea Davis, Mark Campbell, and Tina Camp just as the background. I'm speaking from a place that is and my position is I'm a Black and Chinese mixed race Jamaican who is a naturalized Canadian, and so I have a very diasporic perspective. So the themes, language, counter-narratives, and community integration. I want to refer first to the Recuerdos de Nicaragua archive Melanie and Andy presented, which draws attention to how alienated the archival documents are from the communities that they're supposed to represent and to belong to. They had to actually acquire and purchase these postcards, and I find that their use of the postcards on Instagram lends a vocality to the postcards and the ephemera, and I see it as a kind of a call and response with the diasporic Mosquito community through Instagram and TikTok. The project offers a methodology for archival activism, and particularly through the writing of the description as counter-narratives. And I spent some time on the IG site and found that the use of the digital language and the hashtags and exclamation marks in that communication with the community members who were engaging with the count really represented their sort of the affective side of what these archives are doing for the community, that they're responding to it with their bodies and their emotions. And I find that also reflected in your process, the careful description, and Andy's. There were some videos of Andy digitizing the postcards, and so there's the sound of the scanning, the sound of Andy singing. There's also other videos with, I think, what was mosquito music, all sort of sounding place and time into the archive in this contemporary moment. And so I find it really interesting that that the project, that the collective wants to integrate the language of the Mosquito language into the project. And I wonder what that brings another level of archival justice. and particularly in light of what Embert was talking about and how the Creole language, and I think it might be very similar with Indigenous language, has sounds and a grammatical structure that are themselves archival records because they describe life, they're descriptions of life and the lived experience. So, and I hope I'm not overstating that, Embert, that I was understanding the language as an archival record in the same way that Stanley was talking about culture and memory and cultural practice as archival records. And so Embert was sharing how the linguistic and orthographic research provided evidence for the continuity of African and Indigenous languages in a new Creole environment and drew the lines of expansion to the rest of the French Caribbean. And I thought that was really interesting and important because that academic activism connects the French Caribbean linguistically and transnationally as a strategy to support and encourage the language preservation already happening in the grassroots communities. And finally, just to touch on Stanley's presentation, offering us a decolonial perspective on how to reconfigure what we think of as the archive as being something in the culture and living to work with and against the colonial archives. And so I just want to, sorry, Miguel, how am I doing for time? I thought that message was for me, so I was rushing through.
No, you don't have to rush.
Oh.
I mean, it's almost 4 and we wanted to leave it until 4, but you still have some time. And I think you deserve that time. Of course, Debbie, your comments are really welcome.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up another important point Embert brought up was the discrimination and marginalization that continues to undermine the acceptance of the language. And Stanley also brought that up in terms of what is accepted in the colonial archives, that the practices, the cultural practices and expressions of ordinary people are not really recognized, or that is changing, but that has been one of the problems that are these archival justice actions, why these archival justice actions are necessary. And so I'm going to just segue now to how these relate to my own research. So my research attends to the importance of audiovisual heritage in preserving Black or Afro-Descendant cultures in the Jamaican diaspora. And Embert, I'm stunned by the 40-year audiovisual collection of the Folk Research Center. I think that is a treasure. In my research, I'm co-creating an engaging community to create an audiovisual collection that begins to preserve the embodied archive in the diaspora here in Ontario, Canada. And I consider Stanley and Melanie, Andy, and Embert all probably agree that the archival records are also in the body, the archives of the people, which is very much expanding with this idea of expanding the archival definition. So oral history, song, dance, gestural movements are all really important. And adjacent to that, I'm acquiring and digitizing paper records such as photographs, theater scripts, sheet music, and other ephemera that folks are eager for me to make arrangements to store and preserve. So it's a participatory method, and I think all of your projects really venture into this participatory methodology in which community members work alongside and appraise the archive. So in my project, we will judge together what is important to belong to that community archive. And I'm working in very similar ways, but I'm also working with the Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections at York. So in official archives. Oh, we lost.
What do we lost?
In a major fire. Oh, okay.
Oh,
yeah.
oh.
Okay. Sorry. There was another message that came through.
Right.
So this alleviates. So working with Archive Counter Archives to digitize and store the materials in the Clara Thomas Archives alleviates the financial burden on me alone and opens up institutional funding. So this leads to my first question, and I'm wondering what you all think about collaborative working relationships with community archives and official archives. What are the tensions and possibilities you see or have experience working with, and that in terms of funding, preservation materials, appraising, descriptions. And what compromises must be made, if any, in that search for archival justice through the institutions? My second question concerns digital archives and going beyond the communications function of the digital sphere. There's the Recuerdos de Nicaragua is a digital archive. There's so much that the Folk Research Center is doing digitally, and also the website from St. Kitts and Nevis Archives. How is that going to be preserved? You know, we're talking about ephemeral archives. I think Melanie mentions intangible archives of memory. How are these, you know, digital archives are also really ephemeral. How are we going to preserve what we're trying to preserve? And then my final question is somewhat provocative. And it's thinking through the impact of digital communication on archives in this contemporary moment. Like, how do we deal with misinformation and reclaiming heritage? The kind of activism and archival justice that might make us uncomfortable. Because people, you know, everyone is like looking at archives and creating their own counter narratives to it now. So how do we discern what's authentic? How do we discern particular oral histories? This is something I'm grappling with in the moment. And how do we navigate this as the recombination or remixes of oral histories, languages, and readings of documents that are somewhat questionable? So I'm going to leave you with those questions, and you can engage with them as you wish with what resonates with you, or offer another thread to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Debbie. I believe that your questions are really important, and I believe that they are really fascinating for almost every presentation this afternoon. What I suggest is that we extend our session until 4:15, so we have about 10 more minutes, and we can sort of share that time, you know, among ourselves. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, we're going to begin with Melanie and Andy, and then we'll move to Embert and then Stanley for you to react to these comments and to maybe address some of the questions. Also, I know Tamika has a question for you. Tamika, would you like to pose your question so we can maybe put that on the table and then everyone can maybe contribute to the,
Yes,
to the discussion?
absolutely. Okay, so we have a question here from Mr. Philip Lee. The politics of memory has been mentioned. To what extent is the right to memory in play or in use in Caribbean societies as a further mechanism for contesting dominant narratives?
Thank you, Tamika. So Melanie, then Andy, you have, yeah, we'll try to go until 4:15, if that's okay, me 4:20. So you have about 3 minutes each to respond to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent question. One of the first things that comes to mind in the context of the Mosquito Coast in particular is the ways in which both Black and Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous Mesquitians have consistently actually made use of colonial archives to document their sovereignty over their region. And so today in the contemporary moment, and you know, part of my research is actually looking into this kind of physical and digital activism in which Mesquitians today are, you know, finding colonial maps, travel literature, and a bunch of colonial documents in order to stake their claim to their traditional territories. And this is in the context of the ongoing occupation of Nicaragua on the Mosquito Coast, right? And so there's just a really remarkable way in which contemporary struggles for land and territory continue to be so tied to the kind of colonial history of this region, and in which everyday people are really invested in using colonial archives as well as oral histories and living memory, as Stanley talked about in the context of St. Kitts, to wage their contemporary political struggles. So that's just one of the ways I see that playing out in the context of the Mosquito Coast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melanie. Andy?
Okay. I actually wanted to address one of the questions that Debbie had for us about I don't remember if it was, sorry, I don't remember if it was the first or second question, but it was about what sort of like opportunities and collaborations do we see in the future for our archives, and what are sort of like the possibilities and challenges. And I work as a research assistant at the picture collection at the New York Public Library at Bryant Park. It's a collection of about 16 to 20,000 individual images. Some of them are in a research lab, others are downstairs in the stacks. And they have a residency program. So you can apply as an individual or apply as a collective. And for 6 months, you get access to their picture collection. And what's really interesting is not included in the picture collection, but included in their archives are boxes and boxes, thousands and thousands of postcards. Recuerdos de Nicaragua started as a postcard, mostly postcard acquisitions. So as a collective, that would be a really interesting place to spend 6 months and comb through, different publications and different, and see if there are if there's anything that we could digitize, not necessarily add to our private collection, but things that we could add to our library to help broaden what we're able to contribute as a collective. So that is one example of an opportunity. And when it comes to the physical and, ephemeral sort of protection of these stories, these objects, I think another avenue for us, and something that we're really trying to do, something that we've applied for in the past as a collective, as a digital archive, is also a residency program, a physical residency program, somewhere where we can have an exhibition, somewhere that we can use mixed media. So visual slideshow, audio recordings, textiles, enlarged photographs, and really bring people into a physical space, not only to meet us, but to enjoy sort of the physical exhibition experience of learning about an Indigenous archive. It's totally different than having a digital library, but it's something that we think would benefit as our audience. So those are things that we think about, and as we grow our collection, will be essential in getting more people to understand the cultural history and the political history of the region.
Thank you very much, Andy. And next is Embert. Embert, I hope that you see that question from Hasmin on the Q&A section.
In the Q&A?
Yeah.
Let me go to it.
In case you want to address the question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, history, undergraduate, and a Mauritian. I'm curious how Creole has evolved, however, the histories of other Creole diasporas are not always the same. My question is, how should one push language as an archive for research? I think the response to that question directly is, as we have argued in St. Lucia, is the usage, is to increase the functionality of the language. And in fact, as you do research, you find that there is a body there is a lexical base for almost every subject matter that existed within the domain of the traditional societies and so forth. So but you need support, you need the funding to continue, because we are an NGO and we have to find our own money. And in the midst of all the prejudices, it creates a major challenge. And as I just hinted to Debbie, we are now in the process of rebuilding a lot of the stuff that we lost in a major fire. Around the same year, you had some major fires happening in archives around the world, and we were wondering whether we were just part of this trend. So just to respond to the question from Jasmine, yeah.
Jasmine?
Yeah, the question is, how should one approach using language as an archive for research? Is certainly capture as best as possible the language in usage. It's not simply a question of just noting where it is used, but immersing oneself in the domains, whether it's households or in the creative arts and so forth. And quickly to respond to Debbie's comments about very poignant question just you raised, how you deal with misinformation and the question of authenticity. what we have tried to do is, because of the years of work we are doing, we have literally established ourselves as the authority on the Creole language and its authenticity. Whereas we are not an official authority, but we are authoritative in that you're existing in a space where the language is not officially recognized by the state. But because of the years of research, we can verify and stand for certain things that we are presenting. The question of, I think Debbie raised the question of survival. I think the more we expand the digital footprint of the research is critical for us as well. There is a risk one always sort of scared of, in a sense, is that you overexpose yourself and then you sort of whittle down on the quality of the work that you're doing. But in this day and age, I think for us, expanding that footprint, having digital work spread all over the globe is important. In fact, this has been our saving grace, so to speak, since we lost a lot of stuff in the fire. Once we did collaborative work with a lot of academics and researchers from around the world, we are able now to repatriate some of the stuff that we have lost in the fire. Philip's question is very detailed, and I think I do think I'll have enough time to respond to it. But just to point to Philip, the issue of rights, establishing rights, requires a lot of people's support. For us, rights become established by people voting with their feet. And I just want to use one simple example in the use of Creole. For years, we had what we call, well, Stanley will understand, we had a Calypso competition, which is a song competition in English, in a society where the majority of people are bilingual. One Calypsonian decided one year to sing a song entirely in Creole. And the song was so powerful that he won. There was no word of English. So it erased all discrimination against Creole being a language to be used in the competition. So that is why I talk about when you vote with your feet, the populace have, so in a sense, that's the first stage towards recognition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Embert. And Stanley, you have the last word of our panel today, and then I will provide a final comment. Well.
Yeah, very good questions, and and I endorse the comments made thus far. As it relates to community archives, let's just be very realistic. The repositories and my colleagues around the region, we are for the most part, Commonwealth trained, and in the sense that, we're Commonwealth trained and resourced, in the sense that we can identify, we can appraise appropriately, we know what it is to put on paper, in box, on a shelf, in a 24/7 humidity control, air conditioning, fire suppression, fire alarm room. What we are not fully cognizant of is recognizing that all these details around us are indeed actual assets and materials that really is as archival as what we are paid to do by looking after the repository. That requires a mindset, that requires a different understanding of self, and it also requires resources, audiovisual materials, documentation, video technology, and so forth. That will come in time. What is also happening is there is an increase in community interest in their own memory. In Jamaica, for example, there is a dance hall archive that is triggered by an academic, a professor of the University of the West Indies, and her own materials that she collated over her career and is being used as an archive to generate further interest and academic interest in that particular genre. There are several types of community effort, but more importantly, those efforts are really happening digitally, using social media and so forth. Remember when kinds of groups, or you're a Jamaican if, you're a Barbadian if, and in those community groups, they are sharing details and passing photographs and crowdsourcing and participatory descriptions and all of that, if you want the jargon. The challenge is, however, these community groups do not have or may not even want to establish links with institutions. One, and two, institutions are not resourced to support them in any way. Quite frankly, the mandate of the institution is also problematic. Most of our Caribbean archives are there to support the record-keeping needs of government, first and foremost, not community. And so, you have to play the tune that the piper is playing for. Now, as it relates to this website in St. Kitts is a particularly intriguing case. One, because all this fascinating work is done by somebody who has retired and sadly passed. Somebody who was entering into retirement without a named replacement. And that's very important because in many Caribbean societies, there's only one archivist, right? And chances are that one archivist was sent to the UK or to Canada, or in one case, Australia, to be trained. And so there's a lifetime of service surrounding one person. Now, when that one person goes, an institution is in quandary. And so one of the details she wrote in the text is that she saw the website, this digital collaboration, as the face of, and perhaps a reminder of, the need for a national repository. A national repository that is not just colonial in its holdings, but really national, really cultural in its outlook and in its acquisition and in its understanding of its materials. I still have high hopes for St. Kitts and Nevis. I mean, I have no real influence over there. I don't know, the details, but one would only hope that all this excellent work that has been done will not go to waste, right? And that outreach, and let's be very clear, outreach is not just an activity for an archives in spaces where these materials are at risk. It is a survival mechanism. If people do not know what you're doing, if people don't know what you have, you do not exist. And so if I should look at St. Lucia, for example, and the work of Ms. Margot Thomas, a very strong outreach archivist in this sense, trying to push the need to be reminded, and not just be reminded, but to collate, to receive materials that the community thinks is important, not just from offices or not just things that were, that have survived by people leaving things in family houses or with the passage of time. So there has to be a deliberate attempt to ensure that the community is involved. And quite frankly, the easiest, the cheapest, and chances are the most practical way is using digital technology and collaborating with the community, who is far more interested in digital work than the traditional analog paper lifestyle is, get the community involved digitally. And I think Historic St. Kitts is both a product and a reminder that there is a need for this kind of collaborative institution.
Thank you very much, Stanley. I think with those words, that's a perfect way of ending our panel. I think no doubt that passion, community, visibility, and collaboration are the words that we have shared today. At SERLAC, we certainly feel very humble that you were willing today to share your scholarship, your work, your passion. And with those words, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time, for your dedication, for attending our call to share this space. Thank you to Camila, to Tamika, to Lorenzo, who did join the session, but he didn't receive the speaker link, so he was part of the audience. And certainly to Melanie, to Andy, to Embert, Stanley, and Debbie for your amazing comments, for sure. I believe that your comments and your questions will remain in our heads, and we'll continue this conversation in the near future. So I'm going to ask you to keep in touch and to remain engaged with the work of the center. And hopefully I hope to meet you in person at some point in the future. So thank you very much and enjoy the evening. We will be in touch later on regarding administrative follow-ups. Thank you very much for your time and to
Thank
the
you,
audience for
Miguel.
sure.
Thanks, everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.